back to another episode of Let's Celebrate, a Holiday Origins podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Brown, and today we're celebrating Samhain, also known as our modern day Halloween. Last month's episode, we celebrated the autumnal equinox known as Mabon in the Wheel of the Year. I celebrated by going to a town called San Felipe in Guatemala. It's kind of in the mountains, so the weather is a little cooler there and more autumnal. They have theme parks and it just felt like, since there's not apple picking or pumpkin patches in Guatemala, it was kind of like the closest kind of way that I could celebrate an autumnal kind of feeling. I wanted to do something festive in kind of cooler weather, and since in Guatemala it's switching from the wet season to the dry season, it's super humid and super hot where I live, so it was not feeling like autumn at all. Also, from what I gathered in my area of Guatemala, nobody's even heard of Mabon or the equinox, so no one celebrated it. There are Mayan ruins that I've read about that have some kind of equinox significance, but my home is hundreds of miles from those ruins, so I couldn't make a trip to there. So yeah, I went to the coldest autumnal area that was closest to my house. When I got home from my little trip, I did take some time to meditate on the changes of the seasons and have been working on finding a balance and what that actually means to me in my life right now and the season of life that I'm currently in. So, did you do anything to celebrate Mabon? Were you able to go apple or pumpkin picking in your area? Did you do anything to bring a focus on balance in your life? Or have you already become aware of the Earth's life, death, and rebirth cycle, and did you start to celebrate Halloween early this year? I'd love to hear your celebratory stories. You can email me at letscelebratepodcast@gmail.com. And if that's not your thing, you can also follow me on Instagram at Let's Celebrate Podcast, and you can send me a DM with your celebratory stories on there. And if you prefer to watch these episodes on YouTube, I have a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to, and that is youtube.com/@letscelebratepodcast. You can also watch these episodes on Spotify if you have Spotify. As always, I have a CeLibation that goes along with this episode. That's a themed cocktail with a mocktail option that you can make at home to sip and celebrate along with me as you listen. And the CeLibation for this episode is a Pomegranate Daiquiri in honor of Persephone's descent into the underworld. To make the CeLibation, you need 2 ounces of rum. I used coconut rum. You can use white rum. The coconut rum does add an extra sweetness to it. And then 1 ounce of red vermouth, 1 ounce of pomegranate juice. Then you're going to mix all of that, shake with ice, and strain into your glass. I don't have a martini glass, so I got a fancy goblet. Whatever you want to call this. For a mocktail option, you're going to add 2 ounces of coconut water with 2 ounces of pomegranate juice, shake that over ice, and then strain into your martini glass or fancy goblet, whatever you have. So let's get celebrating Samhain. Samhain is spelt like Samhain, and I've seen some people pronounce it Samhain, but from everything that I've read, it is pronounced Samhain because it is a Celtic Gaelic word. It is also modernly and more commonly referred to as Halloween these days. It's the last of the 3 harvest festivals in the Wheel of the Year, marking the end of the harvest season and the beginning of the winter. If you're interested in learning about those other 2 harvest seasons and you haven't listened to my last 2 episodes, those are covering the first 2 harvest seasons. So go back and listen to those if you're interested. Samhain is celebrated from October 31st to November 1st, and it's the midpoint between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice. So let's start with a little history about this holiday. Samhain's been celebrated for approximately 2,000 to 3,000 years, starting with the Celts in the British Islands, North France, and the Irish Sea. Samhain is the Gaelic name for the month of November, in case you're wondering why it's called Samhain. It's kind of like the beginning of the month. So, in ancient times, in other episodes, I've discussed this, that the day actually was thought to start when the sun set the night before. So, that's why a lot of holidays are celebrated actually on the eve before the day. So this is kind of like the eve of the beginning of November, which brings us into the start of the winter season. Samhain's traditionally believed to be the night when the veil between life and death is most transparent, and it's believed that the dead can pass through to walk in our world. Because of this is the time of the year when people believe that more spiritual and strange things can happen. And the Celts believed that during Samhain, spirits of the deceased could return to visit their homes, and large community bonfires were lit to ward off the evil spirits that could enter. And they did various rituals to honor the dead. This transition from the summer into the winter was historically a reminder to people of how close we are to death, especially in areas where the days stay dark longer and the temperatures are dangerously cold in the winter. This holiday was seen as a sort of deadline to get the preparations done for the winter. Things like getting food prepared and preserved and put away to last for the entire winter, having enough warm clothes and insulation for the home, and enough firewood to keep the hearth burning. And on the other side of the coin, so to speak, of the Wheel of the Year is Beltane, which I discussed in May, which happens to also be my birthday. That's celebrated on April 30th and May 1st. And Beltane's a festival celebrating life and living. So Samhain, being its opposite, is a festival celebrating death and the dead. As the centuries passed, Samhain gradually evolved into what we now know as Halloween. This transformation was influenced by various cultural and religious shifts. In the year 43 AD, the Roman Empire conquered most of the Celtic territory, and in the 400 years that Rome ruled the Celts, they combined a couple Roman festivals with Samhain. Feralia was a festival in late October that was for commemorating the passing of the dead, and Pomona is a festival that honors the Roman goddess Pomona, who was the goddess of fruits and trees. Her symbol was an apple, and many people believe that the tradition of bobbing for apples for Halloween originated with this festival for Pomona. In a 10th century tale called The Wooing of Emer, written by Christian monks, Samhain was said to be a time when peace would be declared. There would be great gatherings with feasts, alcohol contests, and new laws and duties would be ordained. And then with the rise of Christianity in the 4th century, accommodations for pagan beliefs were made. They pretty much just took Samhain traditions and made them more Christian. So in the 9th century is when Pope Gregory made November 1st All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day. And this is when Samhain really began its transformation into Halloween, celebrated on October 31st, which is All Hallows' Eve. Een is Old English for Eve, which is where we get Halloween from. So Halloween is just All Hallows Eve, which is also All Saints Eve. So that name, Halloween, is actually Christian or Catholic origin. And then November 2nd was celebrated as All Souls Day. And these 3 days are collectively called All Hallowtide, which is basically Time of All Saints. So then in the 16th century, with Martin Luther's Protestant movement, Protestants used Halloween as a way to move away from Catholicism, and they refused to celebrate any of the All Hallows days. And then when the Protestants moved to the United States, they were still opposing those Catholic ideas, customs, and traditions that went along with the All Hallowtide holidays. They did, however, bring with them the beliefs that there's a spirit world that can be easier accessed during this time of the year. In the mid 19th century, it was common to have autumn festivals, but it wasn't yet common to have Halloween festivals like we do now. But then at the end of the 19th century, the Irish started to come to the United States, and they brought their Halloween traditions with them. The mostly Mexican and Central American holiday Dia de los Muertos is also celebrated at this time of the year and is a mixture of Catholic beliefs, Mesoamerican rituals, and Spanish culture. Last year's episode called Death Holidays, I covered this holiday in more depth if you're interested in learning more about Dia de los Muertos. Now we're going to look at how Samhain has evolved into the Halloween holiday that we now know today. Samhain was anciently celebrated as a harvest festival, as I mentioned, and it's the last of the harvest festivals that the Celtic or Gaelic people celebrated. Lunacid, that I discussed in August, was the first, and the autumnal equinox or Mabon, which we celebrated last month, was the second, and then Samhain was the last and the biggest of them all. It's the end of the harvest season and the time when people would have been starting to hunker down for the scarier winter months ahead. One of the main ways that the community would commemorate this festival was, of course, with a fire. While the families were out gathering the harvest, they left their hearth fires in their home to burn out. And once they were done with their harvest work, they would join Druid priests at a community gathering where at these gatherings they would light a wheel that represented the sun that caused friction and sparked flames. During this ritual, there were prayers and cattle sacrifices, and at the end, each participant would take a flame from the communal bonfire to relight the home hearth once they got home. There are a few different ideas about what the symbolism of the bonfires was. It could be a form of imitative or sympathetic magic, with the fire mimicking the power of the sun to hold back the decay and darkness of the winter with the powers of growth. It could also be symbolic of burning up and destroying the harmful influences or the bad spirits. And in the 18th and 19th century, it became a popular belief that fire, smoke, and ash had protective and cleansing powers. This night is also said to be the best time to predict the future because of the veil being thinner. Some people did divining practices with the sacrificed animals, doing things like reading the entrails of animals to see the future or to tell someone's fortune. With the belief that the veil was thinner during this time of the year, there are also many tales of fairies, creatures, and ancestors being present. The Celts disguised themselves as they went outside of their village, dressed as animals or monsters to keep the otherworldly creatures from kidnapping them. They believed that by wearing animal skins or masks that the spirits would mistake them for other spirits and would in turn leave them alone. They would also appease the spirits with treats left outside of the village to coax them away from their homes and fields during this festival. This was also believed to keep them safe as well as their crops. There's also documentation that in some areas, people celebrated with 6 days of drinking to excess, most likely drinking beer and mead, and feasting gluttonously. Many people would need to kill the animals they couldn't afford to keep alive during the winter, so this time of the year would have been bountiful with the fresh harvest and the access to more animals to eat than at other times of the year. In the Middle Ages, many of these celebrations moved closer to home. They weren't so much a communal gathering, but people would have bonfires on their personal farms and do rituals to protect their families from fairies and witches and evil spirits that might come to them at this time of the year. This is also when people started carving faces into turnips called jack-o'-lanterns. They would attach them to strings with sticks and fill them with coal. And this is based on the legend of Stingy Jack, who was said to repeatedly trap the devil and only let him go when the devil agreed that Jack would never be sent to hell. But after Jack died, heaven didn't want his soul either, so his soul was forced to wander the earth for eternity. The devil gifted Jack a carved out turnip lit by a lump of burning coal to light his wandering way. People eventually added the carving of scary faces as a way to scare away the evil spirits. The Irish brought this tradition to the United States with them, but with pumpkins being more readily available, that's become more popular in the States. Also, if you've seen a carved turnip face, they are quite terrifying. They're not as cute as our carved pumpkins that we have today. People also started the tradition of a dumb supper. This is a dinner where people would invite their dead ancestors to their homes for a night of dinner and entertainment. They would have a place set for the dead relatives, and after dinner, the children would play games for the dead, and the adults would update them on the past year's news and events. In Ireland and possibly Scotland, they had an ancient practice called mumming, which is basically where our custom of dressing up came from. They would put on costumes and go door to door and sing songs to the dead. In return, they would usually get some kind of cake or sweet treat. In the 15th century, in parts of England, Wales, and other areas of Europe, there was a custom of baking and sharing soul cakes for all Christian souls for All Hallows Tide. They had a tradition called souling, where groups of poor people, usually children, went door to door to collect the soul cakes, and they would pray for the dead friends and relatives of the givers in exchange for the soul cakes. This is also said to be an origin of our trick-or-treating customs. And in medieval France, there was a phenomenon called the Danse Macabre. They believed that the dead rose on Halloween for a wild and hideous carnival in the churchyards. And this was depicted in church decorations and was a reminder to Christians that all earthly things have an end. Many European villages had pageants and people who dressed up as the corpses from different classes of society, and this is thought to be one of the origins of Halloween costume parties. Divination games became popular during the 17th to the 20th century, and most of these divination games involved apples and hazelnuts because in Celtic mythology, apples were associated with the other world and immortality, and hazelnuts were associated with divine wisdom. And as I mentioned earlier, the Roman celebration Pomona had similar beliefs about apples and also hazelnuts. So the game like bobbing for apples, where people place several apples in a tub or basin of water, and participants had to retrieve the apples using only their teeth, was seen as a sort of divination game. Originally, these games were seen more as serious and were more of a ritual than a game that only a few people would have participated in. But over the years, it's become more of a children's game than a divination practice. By the 1900s, Halloween had become a popular American holiday, and it was moved to more of a community gathering with neighbors and children, doing more parties for the children and events rather than being focused on the dead or worrying about witches and the scary things that it had been celebrated as in the past. The party started to be more focused on games, festive costumes, and seasonal foods. Parents were encouraged to take out the frightening and grotesque out of their celebrations. At this time, Halloween began to lose a lot of its superstitious and religious overtones that Christianity and Catholicism had put into it. By the 1930s, trick or treating as we know it began, with people handing out apples and nuts to children going door to door in costumes. This was also seen as a way to bribe kids from not going out and vandalizing properties or doing tricks to the houses. That's why the kids ask trick or treat, implying that if they don't get a treat, then they would do some form of trick to the house. So, how do people celebrate Samhain today? Many people are beginning to more commonly celebrate Samhain. They are embracing the shadow side and the darkness of the season more and focusing on connecting with their ancestors while the veil is thinner. Many people do this by creating an altar to their ancestors, leaving offerings out for the ancestors, or making a plate setting at a meal for a loved one who has passed into the other realm, or connecting to the ancestors by telling stories or reminiscing about them, or cooking their family recipes. Some people also practice old divination rituals. In the 1950s, Halloween became a holiday more marketed to children, and now Halloween is the country's second largest commercial holiday after Christmas in the United States. Popular ways of celebrating Halloween are costume parties, carving pumpkins into jack-o'-lanterns, bonfires, of course, apple bobbing, as I mentioned, visiting haunted attractions, and watching Halloween-themed movies. Many people go trick-or-treating dressed up as monsters or their favorite pop culture characters, or go door-to-door through their neighborhoods. There are also now a lot of trick-or-treating events that are aimed at keeping kids off the streets. So, how can we incorporate traditional ways of celebrating this last harvest festival? As we've discussed, this holiday's theme is centered around death, and it's more about being reminded that death is a normal part of life. And for our ancestors, this time of year would have been a reminder that death was a great possibility if they weren't properly prepared for the winter. So this last harvest festival is a time to give thanks for what the earth has provided for them and make sure that they would have enough to last for the entire winter to stay alive. I also believe that all the themes related to death and monsters and the scariness, the scary themes that are involved in this holiday was a way to pass on these ideas in a fun and entertaining way. This has now evolved into us just wanting to be kind of scared at this time of the year. So looking at the holiday in that light, I think the best ways to celebrate this holiday is to connect to our ancestors, however that looks like to you, because many cultures have their own ways of doing this. So maybe look into how your ancestors would have connected to their ancestors. Or if you have your own spirituality, religious practices, maybe look into how they connect, what kind of rituals you have at your disposal to connect to your ancestors. I think it's also a good idea to take a moment to be grateful for our grocery stores and our warm houses that keep us from needing to be scared of the death that could possibly be inevitable if we had to prepare our food and warmth to stay alive for the winter. Bonfires are also a great way to incorporate a traditional celebration. This holiday has been celebrated with a bonfire for centuries. That could be at your home. You could go find a community gathering. Since Samhain is becoming becoming more of a popular festival. There might even be Samhain festivals in your town. So look into that. Find a community that celebrates these holidays the way that you want to. And if you want to feel the themes of death and monsters, watch a scary movie. I know for me, I always get in the mood to watch a scary movie at this time of the year. So it kind of gives me an excuse to give into, like, I don't normally like scary movies, but this time of the year, I just want to be scared and watch scary movies. You might also want to contemplate the inevitability of death, since we are all going to die. This time of the year is a reminder of that. Work on shifting your perspective from being scared of death to acceptance of it. Isn't it better to celebrate all parts of this beautiful human experience instead of dreading it and being frightened by it? To me, this time of the year is about learning to not let fear guide us in life or into death, but pushing past the fear and embracing death as part of life. Learning to celebrate not only life, but also death, dying, and the dead. So that wraps it up for this episode. I will be back in December to discuss the winter solstice, also known as Yule or midwinter. If you're interested in learning about Thanksgiving's history and traditions, I did an episode on that holiday last year, so be sure to go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please like and subscribe, maybe even leave a review. Do you celebrate Samhain or Halloween or another harvest or death holiday at this time of the year? I would love to hear your celebratory stories, so feel free to send me an email or a DM. You can email me at letscelebratepodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at Let's Celebrate Podcast. And also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel on YouTube, and that's youtube.com/at Let's Celebrate Podcast. All of my references are in the show notes if you're interested in reading more about Samhain and Halloween and their celebrations and traditions. Thanks for listening and joining me on this adventure. Have fun celebrating, and I hope you have a spooktacular holiday.